Dylan stared at the watch on his wrist. It was 6 a.m., but his feet wouldn't move. His mind was lost in a whirlwind of thoughts, each more confusing than the last. He was an ordinary man, a young guy who had never known the horrors of war. He had never even held a weapon before. His life had been simple, a monotonous office job, weekend get-togethers with friends, and dreams of a future free of threats. But today, all that had changed. A sudden call, an unavoidable decision, and now here he was, standing in front of the military training camp. He still couldn't understand why he was here. He had no special talents, no experience in combat, and no desire to be part of some grand fight to save the world. But the government had spoken. Chronarchs, an alien race capable of manipulating time, had arrived, and Earth's only chance for survival was in the hands of soldiers like him. "Dylan, kid, get in there!" The commanding officer shouted, snapping Dylan out of his thoughts. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, and stepped inside. Everything felt different from what he had imagined. The room was cold and silent. There were no words of encouragement, no friendly banter. This wasn't a place for weaklings. As Dylan was led into a training hall, the harsh reality of the situation hit him. All around him, battle-worn soldiers stood, their faces devoid of emotion. These were the men and women who had seen death and knew it was part of life. Their eyes were cold, calculating. He was a stranger in this world, and every part of him screamed to turn and run. "Welcome to the fight, kid," one of the soldiers sneered, his eyes scanning Dylan's empty combat gear. "Don't think this is going to be easy. The Chronarchs don't know the meaning of mercy. If you don't learn how to fight, you're going to be a burden to everyone." The words hit Dylan like a cold wind, a chilling reminder of how out of place he was. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a guy who had no business being here. The battle, the war, it all felt so far removed from his ordinary life. How could he fight against an enemy that could control time itself? How could someone like him do anything in a battle where the stakes were beyond comprehension? As he walked into the combat zone, his sense of dread grew. The sounds of clashing weapons, the sight of futuristic firearms and unknown technologies made his head spin. His hands felt clammy, his mouth dry. Everything around him seemed designed for warriors, for people who were born to fight. But not him. He wasn't born for this. "Get used to it," a gravelly voice called out behind him, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. Dylan turned around to see a trainer, a man with a long scar cutting across his face, his gaze sharp and intense. "We don't have time to waste. The Chronarchs are closing in. If you're not ready, you'll be dead before you know it." Dylan nodded, but his mind was still reeling. How was he supposed to survive this? He had never even fired a gun before, and now, here he was, facing an enemy that could bend the very fabric of reality. His legs felt heavy, his heart raced. Every part of him wanted to run, but there was no escape. He had been thrust into this battle, and if he didn't fight, what would become of him in the world? The voice of the trainer cut through his panic again. "Time's not on our side, Dylan. Remember that. You won't get a second chance. There's no replay, no do-over. If you can't fight, you'll die, and this world will die with you." Dylan swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat on his skin. It was in that moment that he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't just his fight. The entire world was on the line, and if he couldn't find the strength to fight, then everything was doomed. Dylan barely had time to process the whirlwind of his training before he was thrust into the chaos of the battlefield. The moment his boots hit the ground, the world around him exploded into a storm of chaos. The Chronarchs weren't like anything he had imagined. Their sheer power, both in combat and their ability to manipulate time, rendered the military's strategy useless. This wasn't a simple invasion. It was a massacre, a slaughter of epic proportions. The battlefield was a nightmare. Explosions shook the ground beneath his feet, sending plumes of smoke and fire high into the air. The sounds of gunfire and screams echoed in every direction. Soldiers ran past him, faces tight with fear and desperation, but Dylan stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of it all. His training seemed to vanish in an instant. Nothing could prepare him for this. His first instinct was to flee, but there was no place to hide, no safe zone, no escape. It was a war zone, and he was right in the middle of it. A blast sent Dylan sprawling, his body hitting the ground hard. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal and gunpowder. His heart was racing, his breath shallow, as he pushed himself up onto his knees, his hands trembling. His rifle was still clutched in his grasp, but the weight of it felt alien, like an object he could barely comprehend, let alone use. Ahead of him, a Chronarch appeared, a towering figure, its form rippling in and out of time, its movements unnervingly swift. It was as if it could move faster than the blink of an eye. Dylan aimed his rifle instinctively, but before he could fire, the alien vanished, only to reappear a split second later, standing directly in front of him. His body went cold. He barely had time to process the impossibility of it before the Chronarch swung a blade through the air with a sickening hiss. Dylan dove to the side, but the strike was too fast, too precise. He felt the searing pain slice through his side, and the world around him blurred as he crumpled to the ground. His breath caught in his throat. Just as everything went dark, he heard a voice, sharp, commanding. "Move now!" A figure leaped into the chaos, grabbing Dylan by the arm and yanking him out of harm's way. He barely registered the action, too disoriented to even fight back. The figure was a woman, her face hard with determination, her eyes unblinking as she shoved him toward cover. She didn't say anything more, but the urgency in her movements was all Dylan needed to understand. He had no choice. He had to move. She pushed him down into the dirt and crouched beside him, her breath ragged. For a moment, there was nothing but the harsh crackle of gunfire and the distant sound of explosions. The world around them seemed to be breaking apart, crumbling under the weight of the invasion. Dylan's head was spinning, the pain in his side a dull, distant throb. The woman's hand pressed firmly against his shoulder, grounding him in the present. "You're not dead yet, but you will be if you don't follow my lead," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Stay close and don't stop moving." Before Dylan could respond, the ground shook violently as another explosion ripped through the air. His body was flung back, and darkness consumed him once again. Dylan awoke with a jolt, gasping for air. His body ached, every muscle, every bone felt bruised, as if he'd been hit by a freight train. But there was something wrong. The familiar sting of burning flesh, the searing pain in his side, it was all gone. As he blinked through the haze of confusion, he found himself staring at the same sky, the same gray clouds, the same war-torn landscape. It was the same place, the same day, but something was off. He pushed himself up from the cold ground, the sounds of distant gunfire and explosions reaching his ears. His hands trembled as he grabbed his rifle, trying to steady himself. The battle was still raging, but there was no sign of the Chronarchs, at least not yet. It was like the events had stalled, waiting for him to catch up. But then, as he scanned the horizon, it hit him. The woman, the soldier who had saved him, the one who had dragged him to safety, was there again. She was moving swiftly, effortlessly, as if she had already been through this same scene 100 times. Her eyes flicked over to him, meeting his gaze with a hard, knowing look. She didn't look surprised. She didn't even seem startled by his sudden appearance. "Get up," she barked. "Move now before it starts." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He was lost, drowning in confusion. What the hell was going on? His mind raced back to the moment before everything went dark. The Chronarchs had been right there, too fast, too powerful. He should have been dead. And yet here he was, alive, and once again staring down the same battlefield. Did we just... His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and disbelieving. The soldier cut him off, her tone urgent. "Don't waste time asking questions you're not ready to understand. Move." Without another word, she pulled him to his feet and shoved him forward, pushing him back into the heart of the chaos. Dylan stumbled, disoriented. He was still trying to process the impossible, the sensation of déjà vu creeping in like a cold, creeping fog. But the sounds of the battle were getting louder, closer. The Chronarchs were returning. As they sprinted toward cover, Dylan's mind spun. He had been here before. This exact moment. The sounds, the movements, the very air. He had been here before. The question that kept circling in his head was simple. How? The woman glanced back at him, her expression cold. "It's happening again, isn't it?" He could only nod, his mind unable to grasp the full implications of what she was saying. And then, before he could process anything further, everything around them erupted. Explosions tore through the ground, sending them both diving for cover. Dylan's heart was pounding in his chest, the sheer terror of the situation tightening its grip on him once more. They scrambled, moving as if their lives depended on it, because they did. But it wasn't until the third explosion went off, and the fourth, that it hit him like a punch to the gut. The moment he had just experienced, the dive for cover, the explosion, the woman's urgent commands, it was all happening again. It had happened before. Dylan looked up in a daze, feeling his world shatter. He had been through this already. He had died. He had died in the same exact way. The realization struck him with terrifying clarity. What's going on? His voice cracked, barely audible over the chaos. Why is this happening? The soldier didn't stop. She didn't even flinch. You're trapped, soldier. Trapped in the loop, and the only way out is to fight. Before he could say another word, another Chronarch appeared before them, its figure twisting and distorting, moving through time like a shadow. This time, Dylan didn't hesitate. He fired his weapon, but the alien vanished in an instant, reappearing just behind them. He barely had time to react before its massive blade came crashing down toward him. Everything went black again. Dylan awoke to the same damn sky again. He could feel the disorienting pull of deja vu creeping over him, like the edge of a nightmare that just wouldn't let go. The smoke still hung in the air, the echoes of gunfire still rang in his ears, and the ground beneath his feet still trembled with the force of explosions. But this time, he wasn't surprised. This time, he had already died. His hands shook as he rose to his feet, looking around. The world felt frozen, locked in some kind of twisted loop that wouldn't let him escape. But then, through the chaos, he saw her, Lara. The same soldier who had pulled him to safety before, but this time she wasn't just a fleeting figure in the smoke. She stood out in the madness, calm, poised, and completely unfazed by the destruction around her. There was no fear in her eyes, just a deep, unyielding resolve. Dylan's heart skipped a beat, his mind still reeling from the repeated deaths. He had been through this before, felt it all before. The same alien assault, the same desperation. Is this what she's been through? Lara caught his gaze as if she had been expecting him, her cold eyes narrowing slightly, assessing him like a predator sizing up its prey. She didn't look surprised to see him standing there. She didn't even flinch. "You're still here, huh?" she said flatly, her voice lacking any trace of emotion, as if this was just another day on the job. Her tone was sharp, like a blade slicing through the tension. "That's a good sign. It means you're not dead yet." "Dead?" Dylan blinked, still too stunned to fully comprehend. "I don't understand. What's happening to me? To all of us? Why do I keep waking up? Here?" Lara stepped closer, her boots crunching against the debris beneath them. She reached out and grabbed his arm firmly, pulling him toward cover without waiting for a response. "You're trapped, soldier," she said, her voice low and urgent but calm. "In a loop, a never-ending loop. And you've been through it before, just like me." Dylan's mind was spinning, his thoughts struggling to catch up. A loop? A time loop? It didn't make sense. He had died. He had to have died. The wounds, the pain, the blood, it all felt so real. "You've died more times than you can count," Lara continued, as if reading his thoughts. "And each time you wake up again, like it never happened." She paused, her gaze piercing through him like she could see the confusion boiling in his mind. "I've been through this hell for longer than you can imagine, and I've learned how to survive. I've learned how to control it." Survive? Control it? Dylan's chest tightened. The very idea of being stuck in this nightmare, this endless loop, was too much to grasp. But looking into Lara's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Control it? Dylan echoed, his voice rough. "How can we control it? How do we get out?" Lara's lips twitched into a grim smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You don't get out. Not unless you do what's necessary. You fight, and you keep fighting until you find the key to breaking the loop. The Chronarchs, they're the key. They're controlling time, manipulating it. But if you understand how they do it, if you can figure out their pattern, maybe, just maybe, you can end this." Dylan swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing down on him. His mind raced. The Chronarchs? They control time? It felt insane, impossible, like something out of a nightmare. How could anyone fight an enemy that controlled time itself? You think you can teach me how to survive? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lara's eyes softened just for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable. But then she nodded once, decisively. I'll teach you. I'll teach you everything I know, but you'll have to trust me. If you don't, you'll die again and again until you figure it out. Dylan looked at her, at this battle-hardened woman who had already fought and died more times than he could count. He didn't fully understand what she was saying, but there was one thing he did understand. She was his only chance. All right, he said, determination creeping into his voice. Show me! Show me how to fight! Show me how to end this! Lara's gaze hardened again, like she was preparing him for something even darker. First things first. You've got to stop thinking like a rookie. You have to be faster than the Chronarchs. You have to think ahead of them. Every move they make, you need to anticipate it. And don't blink. Don't ever blink. Because the moment you do, you'll lose. Dylan's pulse quickened as she led him deeper into the battlefield, the sounds of war swirling around them. He could see the Chronarchs now, darting in and out of time, each of them moving faster than his eyes could follow. Each step felt like a test, each breath like the last. But as he followed Lara through the chaos, he realized something. This wasn't just a battle for survival. This was a battle for control of time, for control of his fate. And if he didn't master it, he would die again and again until he figured it out. And this time, he was determined to learn. Dylan could feel the sweat dripping down his back as he crouched behind a shattered piece of concrete. The sounds of gunfire and explosions still filled the air, but this time, it wasn't as overwhelming. He was getting used to the chaos, at least a little. The knowledge that everything would reset after his death, every time, made it easier. Or at least, that's what he kept telling himself. But when Lara motioned for him to move, everything came flooding back. The fear, the panic, the helplessness. Move, Dylan, she snapped, her voice sharp, and there was no mercy in her tone. Now! He didn't hesitate this time. He couldn't afford to. He pushed himself forward, diving into the fray with more urgency than ever before. Each step felt heavier than the last, but this time he didn't freeze. He ran. You're doing good, Lara said, keeping pace beside him, her voice calm despite the madness around them. Just keep moving. Keep your focus. Don't let anything distract you. Dylan barely heard her words. His mind was focused on one thing, survival. The loop, the Chronarchs. Every time he died, he learned a little more. But the question lingered. How many more times until I finally get it right? Why can't I kill them? Dylan blurted out between heavy breaths, his voice tinged with frustration. He had tried everything, shooting, dodging, hiding, but it was always the same. The Chronarchs were faster, smarter, and they never stayed in one place for long. They moved in and out of time like it was nothing, and he was left to pick up the pieces. Lara glanced at him, her eyes unreadable. You can't just go in guns blazing, Dylan. You need to think. Every move you make needs to be calculated. Every second counts. The Chronarchs control time. But you need to stop reacting and start anticipating. Dylan felt a flicker of anger rise within him, a fire he didn't want. I am anticipating. I've been through this 100 times already, and nothing changes. Every time I try, I die. Every damn time. Lara didn't flinch at his outburst. And you'll die again. But that's how you learn. Each death is a lesson. You think you've been through this before, but have you really learned from it? Or are you just repeating the same mistakes? Her words hit him like a slap across the face. He had been trying to fight, to force the outcome he wanted. But he hadn't been learning. He hadn't been thinking. Each time he died, it was as if he was resetting, but he wasn't truly growing. His mind kept getting stuck in the same loop, pun intended. Think, Dylan, Lara urged again, more patiently this time. The Chronarchs don't move by chance. They're calculating. Every action they take is a part of a bigger plan. If you can figure out their pattern, if you can predict where they'll be next, you can win. Dylan clenched his fists, trying to push down the overwhelming feeling of inadequacy that gnawed at him. How can I fight against something like that? He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a shaky breath. Each death was a reminder of how powerless he felt. But if he wanted to get out of this, if he wanted to survive, he had no choice but to listen. All right, he said, barely above a whisper. I'm listening. Teach me. Lara paused, then nodded curtly. Good. First rule, control your fear. Fear is what will kill you. You can't let it paralyze you. It's going to be hard, Dylan. Every time you die, the fear will be worse. But the trick is, the more you face it, the more you understand it. You've been afraid of death, but now you have to make peace with it. It's your ally, not your enemy. He frowned, trying to wrap his head around it. Peace with death? Yes, Lara replied. You have to accept that you'll die, over and over. But each time you do, you get a little closer to breaking the loop. If you don't accept it, you'll always be one step behind. Dylan's chest tightened. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. He wasn't sure if he was ready to accept death, not in this way. And when I die, what happens? What do I do? Lara's expression softened for a brief moment, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than cold resolve. You learn. Every time. You watch. You listen. You figure out what went wrong, and then you make it right. You don't let fear cloud your judgment. A Chronarch appeared then, its shape rippling in the air as it moved through time. Dylan tensed, instinctively reaching for his weapon, but Lara's hand shot out, stopping him. Not yet, she said firmly. This time, you're not going to shoot. Watch. The Chronarch darted forward, its blade flashing too fast for Dylan's eyes to follow. But instead of firing, he held his breath and focused. He watched how the creature moved, how it twisted through time, slipping in and out of the present like a shadow. Then it happened, a moment of clarity. Dylan saw it, the pattern. The creature wasn't moving randomly. It was a calculated dance, a strategy designed to overwhelm him. But there was a flaw in its timing, a small gap in its movement, a split second when it was vulnerable. Now, Lara barked. Without thinking, Dylan pulled the trigger, and this time his shot hit. The Chronarch staggered just for a moment before it vanished, reappearing at the far end of the field. Dylan felt his heart racing, but there was no time to celebrate. You're getting it, Lara said, her voice tinged with approval. But don't let your guard down. Not yet. You still have a long way to go. Dylan felt something stir within him, a flicker of hope. For the first time since he'd woken up in the loop, he believed it was possible to break free. Dylan didn't think he could get used to the constant deaths, but after what felt like the 1,000th loop, something started to change. He was no longer caught off guard by the violence, the chaos, or even his own death. Instead, his mind began to sharpen, focusing with laser-like intensity. Each time he died, each time he woke up, he felt his instincts sharpen. His muscle memory was growing, his movements more fluid, more confident. But there was something more, something deeper that had begun to nag at him. It wasn't just about surviving the battle anymore. It was about understanding the Chronarchs and how they could control time so effortlessly. Lara had been right all along. The key to escaping this loop wasn't just about fighting harder, it was about thinking differently. He was sitting in a quiet corner of the battlefield, watching as Lara calmly cleaned her weapon, her expression still unreadable. The chaos of the war raged on around them, but in this moment it felt oddly peaceful. As peaceful as it could be when every part of you was fighting to stay alive, of course. Lara, Dylan said, his voice steady. I think I figured something out. It's not just their speed. The Chronarchs, they're moving through time, aren't they? Lara didn't look up immediately, but the brief pause in her movements told him she was listening. She finished cleaning her rifle, then placed it down with a heavy sigh. Finally, she met his gaze, her eyes sharp as always. You're starting to see it, huh? She said, her voice low, almost approving. Yeah, they don't just move fast. They control time itself, at least their version of it. They're not bound by the same rules as we are. They're bending it, stretching it like it's a rubber band. Dylan's brow furrowed as he processed her words. He had suspected something like this for a while, but hearing it from her made it feel more real. He leaned in, a spark of understanding igniting within him. So, they can change time at will? He asked, his mind racing. Like they can stop it, reverse it, or even loop it? Lara's lips curled into a grim smile. Exactly. But it's not as simple as pressing a button. The Chronarchs don't just pause time like you would on a clock. They're shifting the very fabric of reality. Time isn't just moving forward for them. It's in their hands. It's why they're so dangerous. They can erase things, change things, and make them seem like they never happened. For them, the past, present, and future are just moments. Nothing is permanent. Dylan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Everything he had experienced, the deaths, the pain, the looping, was nothing more than a construct, a manipulation. The Chronarchs didn't just fight him on the battlefield, they fought him across time itself. But if they can control time like that, Dylan said slowly, his thoughts now forming a clear picture, then maybe they're not just trying to kill us. They're trying to break time. They're trying to bend it to their will, to rewrite it. Lara nodded, her expression hardening. You're catching on? The Chronarchs don't just want to win the war, they want to erase it. They want to change history, wipe out any resistance, and build a future where they're in control. And if you're stuck in their loop, well, they've already won. Dylan clenched his fists, a surge of anger rising within him. This wasn't just a battle for survival, this was a battle for control of time itself. But how do we stop them? Dylan asked, feeling the weight of their task bearing down on him. How do we break their hold on time? Lara stood up, dusting the dirt from her pants. She took a deep breath, then looked at him with a gaze that was both calculating and cautious. There's only one way, she said, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken warning. We find the core, the heart of their power. It's not just about beating them in battle. You have to destroy the source of their ability to control time. If you can break their link to time itself, you can stop the loop. You can stop them. Dylan's eyes widened. And how do we find it? Lara hesitated for a moment, then walked over to a set of coordinates on a map she had been studying. I've been tracking their movements. There's a place, a central nexus where their power is strongest. If we get there, we might have a chance. But it's going to be dangerous. The closer we get to their core, the more the loop will try to reset. The Chronarchs will do everything they can to stop us. They'll send us back to the beginning, over and over again. Dylan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Then let's go. We break the loop. We end this. Lara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she nodded. You're ready. And with that, they began their journey, facing down the very thing that controlled their fates, determined to end the cycle once and for all. But deep down, Dylan knew this wouldn't be easy. They were about to dive straight into the heart of the Chronarchs' power, and the further they went, the more the loop would tighten its grip on them. There was no turning back. How many times had Dylan died by now? This time, when he woke up, his body still ached from the previous death. But he no longer panicked. There was no overwhelming fear, no sense of dread when he realized he would go through the same day once again. He simply got up, looked around, and began to fight. Each time like this, he learned something new. But today, it felt different. It was as if something vague was hiding in the movements of his battles, like he had seen them before. The Chronarchs, the way they moved through time, how they waited, then attacked with strategic precision. They weren't just powerful invaders, they knew what they were doing. Lara stood beside him, watching him like a teacher observing a student. She had taught him every small detail about how to fight, how to identify the cracks in the enemy's tactics. But today, she wasn't saying anything, just watching. Dylan didn't need words anymore. He knew what he had to do. He charged toward a Chronarch, his rifle in hand, eyes locked on the target, and fired a barrage of bullets without hesitation. But just as the bullet was about to hit, the Chronarch vanished. Lara's slight head shake signaled that he had failed again. The world reset, and Dylan began again. Not like that, Lara said, pulling him away from the battlefield. You're looking at it wrong. Your mistake is trying to shoot before you understand the Chronarch's method. They don't ever stand still. Dylan sighed, not understanding why she was being so strict. Then what am I supposed to do? I run in, shoot them like you told me, but every time I do that, it never works. Death just feels like a never-ending cycle. You still don't get it. What the Chronarchs are doing is manipulating the flow of time. When they move, they don't go in a straight line like you think. You need to look at their time trajectory, not just their path. Remember, Dylan, they don't just avoid bullets. They're controlling when and where the bullets will land. Lara's words hit Dylan like a bolt of lightning. He had never thought of it like that. How could he anticipate their movements if they didn't move like normal beings? They didn't just run or fight, they controlled time. For the first time, Dylan realized that he needed to think differently, not just shoot, but calculate. Dylan's mind was racing as the battlefield unfolded once again around him. It had been another reset, another death, and another chance to try again. But this time, something felt different. It was as though the very air around him was shifting, warping. He couldn't explain it, but there was a sense of urgency, a pull in his chest urging him to pay attention. Focus, Dylan. Lara's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. She was already moving, darting from cover to cover, never slowing down. Stop hesitating. You've learned the basics. Now you need to apply them. Dylan's hands were steady as he held his rifle, but his thoughts were anything but. His recent revelation about the Chronarchs and their manipulation of time was still fresh in his mind, and with each new loop, he was getting closer to understanding. But what was missing? What was the key? He had tried every strategy, shot from every angle, tried to predict their movements, but each time he was a step behind. Each time he died, he saw the same thing. The Chronarchs slipping through time like shadows. Impossible to pin down, impossible to defeat. Lara, I've been thinking, Dylan called out as he ran to catch up with her. If the Chronarchs control time, if they can move through it, bend it. Why can't we? Why are we stuck here repeating the same thing over and over? Lara paused, a brief flicker of something in her eyes. Then she shook her head, her expression hard. It's not about us bending time. It's about them using it to trap us. They have access to a source, a power that lets them reset time and keep it under their control. If we could get close enough, get to that source, we could break it. But it's not that easy. The more we get closer, the harder it gets. Dylan frowned, trying to make sense of it. So it's all about the source. How do we get to it? Lara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she paused, her gaze distant, scanning the battlefield. I don't know exactly, but I've seen hints in the loops. The Chronarchs are protecting something. Something hidden, something central to their control. If we can get to it, maybe we can disrupt their hold on time. The realization hit Dylan like a wave crashing over him. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for the very concept of time itself. The very thing that made their reality possible was slipping through their fingers, and the Chronarchs were the ones holding it all together. All right, Dylan said, more to himself than anyone else. Let's find it. Let's find their source. But just as the words left his mouth, a Chronarch appeared in front of them, moving with blinding speed, its blade swinging toward them. It was different this time. This one wasn't just trying to kill them, it was trying to stop them. Its movements were more deliberate, more forceful. Without thinking, Dylan fired. The bullet hit its mark, but the Chronarch didn't flinch. Instead, it vanished, reappearing just behind him. He turned to face it, his heart racing. But as he aimed his rifle, the creature slipped out of time once again, disappearing before his eyes. Lara grabbed his arm, pulling him back. No, don't waste your energy. You can't fight it the way you've been trying to. You need to get in their mind, anticipate their moves. Yes, but also understand them. Dylan took a breath, trying to steady himself. But how do I understand something that's not even bound by the same rules? How do I fight something that controls time itself? Lara's eyes locked onto his, her voice quiet but intense. By thinking the way they do. The Chronarchs don't fight for survival. They fight to preserve their control. They are always one step ahead because they don't just move through time. They're always ahead of the game. You need to think of time like a weapon, Dylan. Not just something you live through, but something you use. Just like them. Dylan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about being faster. It wasn't about outsmarting the Chronarchs. It was about becoming the time they controlled, learning to manipulate it instead of being its prisoner. The battlefield felt different today. The air was thick with tension, the ground trembling beneath their feet as explosions rocked the distance. But Dylan didn't flinch. He no longer reacted to the chaos around him. This time, he was focused, his mind clear. The loops, the resets, they no longer overwhelmed him. He had learned to anticipate them, to move with them, to use them. Lara was beside him, her movements fluid and precise, as always. But this time, she wasn't just guiding him through the chaos. She was watching him closely, waiting for him to put what he had learned into practice. Remember, Lara's voice cut through the noise, the Chronarchs don't just move through time, they manipulate it. You need to think of every second like a battlefield of its own. Not just the present, all of it. Understand where they've been, where they're going, and use that to your advantage. Dylan nodded, his eyes scanning the battlefield. He saw a Chronarch appear in the distance, its figure warping in and out of time. For a moment, the world seemed to slow, the creature's movement suspended as it began to take its next step. Dylan didn't hesitate. Instead of running toward it, he waited. He waited for the moment it would reappear, not where it had been, but where it was going. His heart pounded in his chest as the Chronarch reappeared before him, its blade flashing toward him. But Dylan was ready. He ducked low, sidestepping with precision, his movements in sync with the Chronarch's manipulation of time. He wasn't chasing it anymore. He was moving with it. The blade passed over his head, missing by inches. Dylan could feel the wind from its swing on his skin, but he didn't flinch. He was no longer the prey. He had become the hunter. He reached for his sidearm, fired twice, and watched as the Chronarch stumbled back, its form flickering, destabilizing. It wasn't dead, not yet, but Dylan had scored a hit. And in that moment, he felt the rush of realization. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning. He was becoming the kind of fighter who could outsmart time itself. But then, just as quickly as the victory had come, it slipped away. The Chronarch disappeared once again, its movements warping through the air. Dylan couldn't react fast enough. His heart sank as the Chronarch reappeared, its blade now aimed directly at his chest. In an instant, he felt the familiar cold grip of fear, but he didn't give in. This time, he closed his eyes, blocking out the panic. He knew this would happen. He had seen it before. The Chronarchs didn't just kill him, they tested him. Each time, they forced him to grow, to learn from his mistakes. And now, Dylan understood. The only way to defeat them was to stop seeing them as enemies and start seeing them as teachers. He opened his eyes just in time to see the Chronarch's blade coming down. But instead of dodging, he stepped forward, grabbing the blade with his bare hands, feeling the heat of it as he slowed its motion. He had learned to manipulate the time around him, just like they did. The Chronarch froze. The moment suspended as time itself seemed to bend around Dylan. His heart raced, but now, for the first time, the fear was gone. He wasn't trapped in time anymore. He was mastering it. In that moment, everything around him seemed to stand still. The explosions, the gunfire, the chaos, they were all distant, irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was this. Dylan had finally learned to control the flow of time, even if it was just for a moment. With a single motion, he snapped the Chronarch's blade in half, sending it to the ground. The creature vanished, but Dylan didn't feel triumphant. He felt different. He had unlocked a new part of himself, a part that was no longer afraid of time, but embraced it. Lara stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Well done," she said quietly, her tone almost surprised. "You've learned to move with time. But don't get cocky. That's only the beginning." Dylan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the empty space where the Chronarch had stood moments before. "I'm not done yet. I've got more to learn." And he was right. There was still much more to discover. But for the first time, Dylan felt like he was truly in control. The loop was no longer his prison. It was his battlefield, and he was ready to fight. Dylan stood alone for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The battlefield was still chaotic around him, but in this instant, it felt strangely calm. His hands were steady, his mind clear. The Chronarch was gone, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the feeling of control, of mastery over time itself. It was fleeting, but it was real. He could still hear Lara's voice, her words echoing in his mind. "Don't get cocky. That's only the beginning." But for the first time, Dylan didn't feel like a prey animal running from the hunt. He wasn't merely surviving anymore. He was starting to see time as something he could wield, something he could use to his advantage. Lara appeared next to him, stepping out of the smoke and dust, her face unreadable. "Impressive," she said quietly. "But remember, it's not just about moving with time. You have to think about the consequences of every step you take. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the loop will start all over again." Dylan nodded, his gaze still fixed on the space where the Chronarch had stood. "I'm starting to understand." But it's not enough, is it? No, it's not enough, Lara replied, her voice hardening. You've learned how to control time for a moment. Now you need to do it consistently. Every second, every battle. You need to stay ahead of them. And when you do, maybe, just maybe, you'll have a shot at breaking this loop for good. Dylan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The fear, the frustration, the sense of being trapped, they were all fading now. He wasn't just waiting for the next reset. He was driving the next moment forward. Let's go, he said, determination creeping into his voice. I'm ready. Lara gave him a small nod, her eyes still sharp as ever. We'll see. And together they moved forward, deeper into the battlefield, where the fight against the Chronarchs was far from over. But Dylan wasn't the same man who had started this journey. He was learning, adapting, becoming something new. The loop no longer had power over him. It was his tool now. Dylan woke up again, his heart racing, his body still aching from the last death. But this time, something inside him had changed. He had learned to control time for a moment. He had seen it, understood it, but now he had to master it. The battlefield was different today. The Chronarchs seemed even faster, their movements more unpredictable, as if they knew he was starting to catch on. They were always one step ahead of him, bending time around them with every move. But this time, Dylan wasn't afraid. He could hear Lara's voice in his mind. You're not done yet. This is just the beginning. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. But he didn't have a choice. The world around him was already falling apart, and the only way to survive was to push forward. Lara appeared at his side, moving with a grace that came from years of experience. She barely looked at him, her focus entirely on the Chronarchs closing in. You know what to do, she said quietly. Remember, they control time. You can't fight them with brute force. You have to outthink them. Dylan nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. He had been practicing, honing his skills, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The Chronarch in front of him flickered in and out of time, its movements a blur of speed and precision. Dylan fired, but the shot missed by inches as the creature vanished into the air, reappearing behind him. He spun around just in time to feel the cold steel of its blade graze his shoulder. He staggered back, the pain sharp and sudden. Not again, he thought. But before he could react, the Chronarch was gone, slipping through time once more. He didn't even get a chance to breathe before another Chronarch appeared, this one even faster than the last. His mind raced, trying to predict its next move, but it was too late. He was caught off guard again. The next reset came almost instantly. He was back at the beginning, alive again, but just as lost as before. The world around him was the same, but he was different. He had failed. Again. What went wrong, he muttered to himself, his frustration bubbling over. I saw it. I knew what was coming, but I still couldn't stop it. Lara appeared beside him, her eyes cold but understanding. She didn't need to say anything. She just gave him a look, one that said everything he needed to hear. She didn't blame him. She never did. She knew that every failure was part of the journey. Sometimes, Dylan, you don't see what you need to. You can't just react. You have to anticipate, but also adapt. You can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results. Dylan's mind raced. Adapt? But how? He had learned to move with time, to bend it, but it still wasn't enough. The Chronarchs were always a step ahead, always anticipating him. How could he fight something that already knew his every move? He stood up, his hands shaking with frustration. How do I break the loop, Lara? I can't keep dying. I can't keep failing. You will, she said simply, but only if you stop fighting against time. You're so focused on winning that you're forgetting how time works. Chronarchs don't fight to win. They fight to preserve their control. They don't fear death. They understand it. If you can start thinking like that, if you can accept your death, then maybe, just maybe, you'll be ready. Dylan stared at her, his breath coming in short bursts. It was true. He had been running, fighting, trying to outrun death. But that wasn't the answer. He had to stop fighting time. He had to accept it, even if it meant dying over and over again. Another Chronarch appeared, and this time Dylan didn't hesitate. He didn't try to predict every move. Instead, he let go of the fear. He closed his eyes, feeling the flow of time around him, like a river rushing forward, unstoppable. For the first time, he embraced the moment. The Chronarch lunged at him, its blade aimed directly for his chest. But instead of dodging, Dylan stepped forward, letting the blade pass just an inch from his skin. He wasn't trying to survive this time. He wasn't trying to fight. He was just moving with it, letting the moment unfold. And then, for just a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The Chronarch hesitated. Dylan could feel its movement slow, the time around them distorting. He raised his rifle, aiming for the creature's center, and fired. The shot landed squarely, and the Chronarch staggered back, its form flickering as it struggled to maintain control. It wasn't over. Not yet, but Dylan felt something shift inside him. He was learning. He was adapting. Each failure wasn't a setback, it was a lesson, and every death was bringing him closer to breaking the loop. Dylan stood still, his eyes fixed on the dark portal ahead of him. It felt like a nightmare, yet it was all too real, because within it lay the source of everything. The Chronarchs, the beings who manipulated time. They weren't just invaders, they were the very overseers of time itself. They intervened with the flow of the universe to maintain a world of their own. Like a sharp blade, they had severed any chance of change, any notion of the future, just to retain their power. Dylan could feel the ground beneath him shifting, as though the earth itself was slipping away. This portal was not merely a physical threshold, it was a trap. Each step he took toward it brought him closer to a price he couldn't reverse, an agonizing choice. Lara stood beside him, calm as ever, but today she couldn't hide the shadow of concern in her eyes. She looked at Dylan with a steady gaze, but it was tinged with the weight of their journey. "We've come this far," Lara said, her voice a sharp cut through the silence. "You've learned to control time. But now what matters isn't controlling time. It's understanding the cost of breaking it." Dylan looked into her eyes, feeling the tension build in his chest. How many times had they fought together? How many times had he seen her sacrifice and she had seen him die in each loop? They were the only ones left, but everything they had fought for could shatter in a single moment. He turned his gaze back toward the portal. A sudden, brilliant flash of light erupted from within, and a figure appeared. Not a typical Chronarch. This was the leader, the one who had orchestrated the entire loop. A creature not only in control of time, but the very fabric of the universe. It wasn't just an enemy, it was time itself. "Just press the button," the Chronarch leader said, its voice deep, resonating with power. "Everything will stop. You and she will remain in this loop with no past, no future, only the present. This is what you want, isn't it?" Dylan felt his stomach twist. This world, it wanted them trapped in a never-ending cycle. No more death, no more struggle, just the peace of an eternal loop. But in that moment, a thought sparked in Dylan's mind. That wasn't his choice. He didn't want to die over and over in a meaningless loop. He didn't want to be a part of a world without a future. Lara turned to him, her gaze sharp. "Dylan, this is the moment you have to decide. If you break the portal now, everything we fought for will be erased." Dylan stared at her, realizing that she was facing the same decision. She had fought, died with him, and stood by him through countless loops, but this time was different. Their sacrifice wouldn't just be another death. If they broke the loop, everything could disappear, including her. "We've lost too much already," Dylan said, his voice steady. "But we won't let it die in vain. We have to break it. We have to find a new future." But the Chronarch leader didn't agree. It stepped forward, each movement causing the space around them to ripple. Time itself seemed to bend and twist with every step. It raised a hand, and the time around Dylan and Lara began to contract, as if they were trapped in an invisible cage. "You cannot escape this loop," the leader said, its voice cold. "This world has already been erased." Dylan didn't have time to think. He looked at Lara one last time. "Together," he said, more to himself than to her. He was no longer afraid. Time was no longer his enemy. He knew that if he wanted to change this world, he had to break the core of it. He took a step forward, pushed Lara behind him, and raised his hand, targeting the very core that the Chronarchs had created. He stumbled back, his hands gripping his head in frustration. No, there has to be something left. There's got to be something we can do to fix it." Lara stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's too late for that now." Her voice softened. "We can't change what's been undone, Dylan. We chose to break the cycle, to stop the Chronarchs, but the price was the world we knew. It was never going to be a clean break." Dylan's eyes burned, and for the first time, he felt completely lost. They had done everything they could, fought, sacrificed, and now, what was left? What was their purpose in this new world where nothing made sense anymore? Was it worth it? Dylan's voice was barely audible, the question hanging in the air like a weight too heavy to carry. Is this what we've earned? The end of everything we loved? Lara's eyes darkened as she took a step back. She knew what he was asking, and she felt it too. The loss, the hopelessness. Maybe it's not about whether it was worth it, Dylan. Maybe it's about the fact that we chose it. We had to choose. Because if we hadn't, we would have stayed trapped in a lie forever. The silence between them stretched, suffocating, but Dylan understood. They were no longer trapped in the loop, but they had lost everything they had fought to save. Their future, their memories, everything was gone. He reached for Lara's hand, his fingers trembling. We're free, but I don't know what to do now. Where do we go from here? She squeezed his hand, her expression hardening with resolve. We move forward, Dylan. We find a way. We've earned the right to rebuild. Together. Dylan took a deep breath. He didn't know what the future would bring, or whether there even was one anymore. But one thing was certain. They had taken the risk. They had chosen to break the cycle, to step into the unknown. And even though it felt like the weight of the world was on their shoulders, they were free. He stumbled back, his hands gripping his head in frustration. No. There has to be something left. There's got to be something we can do to fix it. Lara stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. It's too late for that now. Her voice softened. We can't change what's been undone, Dylan. We chose to break the cycle, to stop the Chronarchs, but the price was the world we knew. It was never going to be a clean break. Dylan's eyes burned, and for the first time, he felt completely lost. They had done everything they could, fought, sacrificed, and now, what was left? What was their purpose in this new world where nothing made sense anymore? Was it worth it? Dylan's voice was barely audible, the question hanging in the air like a weight too heavy to carry. Is this what we've earned? The end of everything we loved? Lara's eyes darkened as she took a step back. She knew what he was asking, and she felt it too. The loss, the hopelessness. Maybe it's not about whether it was worth it, Dylan. Maybe it's about the fact that we chose it. We had to choose, because if we hadn't, we would have stayed trapped in a lie forever. The silence between them stretched, suffocating, but Dylan understood. They were no longer trapped in the loop, but they had lost everything they had fought to save. Their future, their memories, everything was gone. He reached for Lara's hand, his fingers trembling. We're free, but I don't know what to do now. Where do we go from here? She squeezed his hand, her expression hardening with resolve. We move forward, Dylan. We find a way. We've earned the right to rebuild, together. Dylan took a deep breath. He didn't know what the future would bring, or whether there even was one anymore. But one thing was certain, they had taken the risk. They had chosen to break the cycle, to step into the unknown. And even though it felt like the weight of the world was on their shoulders, they were free. For better or for worse, they had made their choice. The battle with the Chronarchs had been fierce, but victory had come at a cost. Dylan and Lara stood in the shattered remnants of the world they once knew, the silence hanging heavy around them. The landscape had been torn apart, time itself shattered by the forces they had fought against. But while the Chronarchs were gone, their hold on reality was not easily erased. For a moment they stood together in the aftermath, both physically and emotionally drained, unsure of what came next. They had saved the world, but at what cost? The scars of their struggle were written in the wreckage around them, the broken pieces of a world that no longer felt like their own. Dylan glanced at Lara, her face pale, eyes hollow from the battle they had just survived. The weight of what they had lost was clear in her gaze. This wasn't just about survival anymore. They had fought for freedom from the Chronarchs, but the victory felt empty. They hadn't just been battling enemies, they had been fighting against time itself. And in doing so, they had torn apart the very fabric of the world. Do you think we've done enough? Lara's voice was almost a whisper, carrying the burden of the question that neither of them could answer. Dylan opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. The truth was, he didn't know. The Chronarchs were gone, but what would come in their place? They had shattered time, but the pieces of the world they had broken seemed to be just as fractured as before. But they had no time to dwell on it. The very air around them was crackling with energy, and a strange pressure filled the space, as if time itself was pushing back. And then, as if the world had been holding its breath, the Chronarch leader appeared before them. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. But the leader was not easily outwitted. Each time they thought they had it cornered, it would flicker and vanish, reappearing moments later in a new position. The Chronarch leader's ability to move through time with such precision and speed made it nearly impossible to predict, leaving Dylan and Lara constantly a step behind. The fight became a blur of dodges, counters, and rapid shifts in time, with the leader using the very fabric of reality against them. The air vibrated with the energy of their struggle, and every movement they made seemed to be met with an instantaneous response from the leader, its power bending time to its will. Dylan's mind raced, trying to find a pattern in the chaos, something, anything, that would give them an advantage. He fired another round, aiming not for the leader directly, but for the ground near it, forcing a small disruption in the flow of time. For a split second, the Chronarch leader staggered, its form momentarily unstable. That was the opening they needed. "Now, Lara!" Dylan shouted. Without hesitation, Lara sprang forward, using her own understanding of time manipulation. She aimed a powerful strike at the leader, timing it perfectly with Dylan's distraction. The leader faltered again, and this time it didn't recover immediately. Dylan lunged, firing multiple shots in quick succession. Each round aimed to create the illusion of a loop, forcing the Chronarch leader into a pattern of resetting. The leader's form flickered violently, caught in the trap they had set. It was beginning to lose control, its movements no longer as fluid and precise as before. Dylan's heart raced, adrenaline pumping as he and Lara worked in unison, their movements synchronized, forcing the leader into a pattern it couldn't escape. With one final coordinated effort, they pushed the Chronarch leader into a full reset loop, trapping it within its own manipulation of time. Its form destabilized, and the very air around it began to crack and warp, time itself rebelling against the leader's control. The leader's eyes flashed one last time, its voice distorted and desperate as it whispered, "You cannot escape time." And then, with a violent eruption of light and energy, the Chronarch leader exploded, its essence tearing apart as the very fabric of time buckled under the immense force. The shockwave blasted through the battlefield, knocking Dylan and Lara to the ground. The explosion of energy was not just a physical destruction. It was as if the very essence of time had fractured, unraveling the power that the leader had held over reality. The ground beneath them cracked, the sky twisted in unnatural ways, and the air shimmered with residual energy. The world seemed to bend, the edges of reality blurring as time itself snapped and contorted around them. Dylan shielded his eyes from the blinding light, but it was impossible to escape the overwhelming intensity. It felt like they were caught in the moment of reality breaking apart, pulled apart by the force of the blast. The air was thick with the remnants of the explosion, and for what seemed like an eternity, there was nothing but light, pure, burning light that seared through everything. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light disappeared, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Everything around them felt still, unnaturally still. The battle was over, but there was no victory cry, no sense of accomplishment. There was only the haunting realization that they had done the unthinkable. Dylan stood slowly, his body aching from the shockwave, his mind still reeling from the intensity of the fight. He looked over at Lara, who was still on the ground, her face painted with exhaustion and the weight of what they had just done. Together, they had stopped the Chronarch leader, but at what cost? They had broken time, and now the world around them seemed to lie in ruins, a fragile and broken shell of what it had once been. The Chronarchs were gone, but so was everything they had fought to protect. "Is it over?" Dylan whispered, his voice barely audible in the silence. Lara didn't answer right away. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow, as if she had already known the price they would have to pay. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "It's over, but everything has changed." Dylan nodded slowly, understanding that their victory had come at a cost far greater than they had ever imagined. They had fought for a future, but in doing so, they had erased it. The world they had saved no longer existed. Together, they stood in the aftermath, knowing that they had made their choice. And now, they would have to live with the consequences. Dylan groaned as the light began to fade, his body feeling like it had been torn apart and pieced back together in an instant. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still standing or floating. The world around him was a blur of colors, swirling together like a dream unraveling. Then the light receded. As the last remnants of the explosion faded, the oppressive silence returned, but it was different now. The air felt thick with the weight of what had just occurred, like the world was holding its breath. Dylan blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The battlefield was gone, replaced by an empty, distorted expanse. The ground beneath him was cracked, but there was no sign of the Chronarch leader or any of the destruction that had once plagued their world. For a moment, Dylan wasn't sure if they had succeeded at all. The reality around them felt warped, shattered even. The world was a canvas of broken fragments, a space between moments, as if the fabric of time itself had been unraveled. Lara? Dylan's voice cracked as he searched the expanse, his chest tight with uncertainty. Lara stood not far from him, her figure slightly disoriented, but intact. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no battle left in her gaze. She wasn't searching for an enemy. She wasn't trying to keep fighting. "We did it," she said quietly, almost to herself. But there was no triumph in her voice. There was only the heavy realization of the cost. Dylan nodded slowly, still trying to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. The Chronarchs were gone, the leader destroyed, but at what cost? They had shattered time, manipulated it to their will, and in doing so, they had broken everything. The world they fought for, the future they had hoped for, it no longer existed in any form they recognized. Is this it? Is this our world now? Dylan whispered, stepping forward, unsure if he was even truly walking on solid ground. Lara's expression was distant, as if she too was still trying to piece everything together. "I don't know, Dylan, but it's all we have left. It's everything we fought for, and nothing at all." The silence stretched between them, and for the first time the weight of their victory, if it could even be called that, settled fully on their shoulders. Time, as they had known it, had snapped. The Chronarchs, the endless loops, the war, it had all unraveled. What was left was a broken world, a fractured timeline, and the two of them standing at the center of it all. "There has to be something we can rebuild," Dylan muttered, as much to himself as to Lara. Lara looked at him, her eyes weary but still holding a glimmer of determination. "Maybe. But rebuilding isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about finding a new way, a way to live, even when nothing feels familiar anymore." Dylan's heart clenched at the thought of all they had lost. The world, their friends, everything they had fought to save. But there was a flicker of hope that couldn't be extinguished. They had broken time, yes, but perhaps in breaking it, they could also create something new, a new future. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what would come next or what the world would look like after the dust settled. But as they stood together in the remnants of what had once been, Dylan knew one thing for sure: they had chosen their path. And now it was time to walk it, even if it meant starting from nothing. With a deep breath, Dylan turned his gaze forward. There was no turning back now, only forward. Together, they would rebuild. The ground beneath them felt different, solid, but with an unfamiliar texture. The air was thick, heavy with an eerie silence. Dylan blinked rapidly, trying to adjust his vision, but everything around him seemed wrong. The sky, once a clear expanse, was now a swirling mass of colors that didn't belong in any reality he knew. The trees, the ground, even the wind felt displaced. Lara was beside him, her hand gripping his arm. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with confusion. What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Where are we?" Dylan didn't have an answer. He looked around, but nothing was familiar. The air felt stale, the landscape unfamiliar. It wasn't the battlefield they had just left behind. It wasn't the world they knew. "It's different," Dylan said, his voice low. "We're not in the same place anymore." They both turned in a slow circle, scanning the surroundings. The world felt like a blank canvas, a place where time didn't exist in the way they understood it. Everything seemed still, yet somehow unstable. There was no sign of the Chronarchs, no remnants of their enemies, just an eerie silence, a world they couldn't make sense of. Dylan's pulse quickened. Had the Chronarchs really been defeated? Had the destruction of the leader been enough to break their grip on time? Or had they just stumbled into something worse? Something beyond their control? Lara's voice broke through his thoughts. Dylan, I don't remember. I don't remember any of it. The loops, the battles, it's like none of it happened. Dylan froze, turning to face her. You don't remember? She shook her head slowly. No, I don't remember the fights, the loops, the sacrifices, nothing. It's like it was all erased. Her eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and concern. What have we done? He didn't have an answer. He felt everything she had said in his own mind. The battle, the chaos, it all seemed so far away, so distant now. They had broken time, but the consequences weren't over yet. They were standing on the threshold of something new, something uncertain. Dylan looked out across the strange, unfamiliar world before them. It was as if time had been undone, but in a way they couldn't understand. They had reset the Chronarch's influence, but the world was not the same. It's not over, Dylan said quietly. We've changed everything, but I don't think we've finished what we started. There's something more, something waiting. Lara met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the uncertainty they both felt. So, what now? What do we do? Dylan took a deep breath, the weight of the question settling in. He didn't know, but one thing was clear. Whatever this new world was, it would be theirs to shape. Together, they began to walk forward, unsure of what lay ahead, but knowing that the future was now in their hands. The days that followed their victory were eerily calm. Dylan and Lara, after defeating the Chronarchs and breaking the time loop, began to search for survivors. They moved through the ruins of Earth, stepping carefully among the remnants of cities and broken landscapes, convinced that they had set things right. But something felt off. The world around them was quiet, too quiet. Lara, her face troubled, looked at Dylan. Where is everyone? We can't be the only ones left. Dylan scanned their surroundings. The silence weighed heavily on him. We can't be. There has to be more survivors. We just need to find them. They continued their journey, moving through barren streets and desolate cities, searching for any signs of life. Every day felt like the last. The earth they walked on seemed like a different place entirely, one that had been stripped of its rhythm, its heartbeat. One day, while walking through a forgotten neighborhood, they noticed something. A faint trace, a footstep, a sign of life. Their hearts quickened. They followed the trail carefully, eager but cautious. The tracks led them to a village that seemed to have been abandoned, yet there were remnants of life. Wood gathered for a fire, tents pitched with care, and food supplies scattered about. This is it, Lara whispered, stepping forward. Someone was here. Dylan nodded. We're not alone. But when they ventured further into the village, they heard a noise, soft like footsteps from behind a collapsed building. Dylan signaled for Lara to stop, and they waited, listening intently. A figure emerged from the shadows, an older man, disheveled and dirty, but very much alive. Who are you? The man asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Dylan stepped forward cautiously. We're looking for survivors. We've come from the ruins. Are there others? The man's eyes widened, and he shook his head slowly. I thought I was the last one. I've been here, alone, waiting. I didn't think anyone was left. Relief surged through Dylan. There was someone else. They weren't alone. But the man's next words brought a new weight to the situation. The cities are gone, he said, his voice low. Everyone, gone. What happened to the world? How did you survive? Dylan exchanged a glance with Lara, both of them thinking the same thing. They had defeated the Chronarchs, but was it enough to bring back the world they once knew? We broke the cycle, Dylan replied. We fought and destroyed the Chronarchs. We thought the world could be saved, that we could start over. But the man's face remained grim. It's not that simple. Nothing feels the same. I don't know if it's even worth trying to rebuild. The cities, they're just memories now. Lara looked at the man, her voice steady yet firm. We don't give up. We fought too hard for that. We can rebuild, we can restore what's been lost, but we can't do it alone. Dylan nodded in agreement. We need to find others, rebuild, and start fresh. We can't let this world stay broken. For a moment, the man hesitated, then, with a deep sigh, he nodded. Maybe you're right. I've been waiting for someone to bring hope back. Maybe you two are the ones who can do it. They spent the next few days with the man, learning more about the survivors and what little was left of their world. There were signs of life, pockets of survivors who had managed to stay hidden, waiting for a leader to guide them. But despite the glimmer of hope, there was still an underlying sense of unease. Was this all just a fragile illusion? As Dylan and Lara planned their next steps, the world around them seemed to shift. The air felt heavier, the atmosphere colder. The light seemed to flicker, almost like the world was trying to reset itself. And then, one night, it happened. A flash of bright light exploded across the sky, blinding them both. The ground beneath their feet rumbled, and before they could react, the world shuddered. Time, once again, was bending, warping, shifting. Dylan and Lara stumbled, falling to the ground as the world around them fractured. They reached out, trying to steady themselves, but the moment the light hit, everything became a blur. They woke up. It was the same day, the same events, the same people. The time loop had reset. Dylan and Lara stood in the same place, but they knew now what had happened. It wasn't over. They hadn't truly broken the cycle. They had simply delayed it. The world they had thought they had saved was now caught in another reset. Dylan looked at Lara, his face a mixture of frustration and determination. We've been here before, but this time we know what's coming. We can end this. We can break the loop. Lara met his gaze, her eyes filled with the same resolve. We've done it before, we'll do it again, and this time, we finish it. The battle was not over. The fight to break free from the cycle, to break time itself, had just begun. And together, Dylan and Lara would face it, this time knowing everything they needed to change the world for good.